It's time. A proper set of videos covering Sega's premier contribution to the world of RPGs, that being Phantasy Star. A game and series that did things a little differently from the other big names in the genre, with the final result being 4 games that, for the most part, come together as a whole saga spanning thousands of years in a science fiction themed universe. Not that it's the sort of series where you have to play them in order so that you can enjoy them fully. There's people who started with the first game that we're covering today, when it was positioned as the most advanced game you could get on consoles at the time. Similarly, there are people who started with 2 because it was the first RPG available on a 16-bit machine, some started with 4 because it was so utterly revered, and, well, there are probably some unfortunate folk who started with the third game, which is not the ideal way to start playing Phantasy Star. In any case, each of the 4 main Phantasy Star games are worthy of a video on their own, and naturally we're going to kick off with the first game, released in 1987 for the Master System. While Phantasy Star does primarily exist simply because Sega wanted an RPG of their own that could compete with the runaway success of games like Dragon Quest on the Famicom, it would be a great series in its own right over 2 generations of machines, still one of Sega's most beloved ones to this day. It unquestionably deserves a proper treatment, so let's get on with it, and go back to in and around the start of 1987. The concept of the JRPG, as we would call it in the West, was still kind of new in the start of 1987. Primarily there was one series that towered over everything, that being Dragon Quest. The taste for RPGs in general had developed a couple of years previously, when a small scene that was largely based around rougher games for platforms like the PC-88 was thrust open by the success of 1984's The Black Onyx, a strange beast considering that the game barely made it outside of Japan, but was made by the Hawaii-based Bulletproof Software, led by Dutch video game designer Henk Rogers. Rogers went all out promoting the game, essentially touring around the Japanese gaming press and teaching them how to play this very much D&D inspired game, showing them how to create parties and what have you, and the result of his efforts was a big hit that introduced RPGs to the majority of Japanese game players. From the success of Black Onyx came an appetite for the big American games that Rogers himself was inspired by, those being Wizardry and Ultima, while a more action-led RPG scene developed around early successors like Hyderlide and Dragon Slayer, not to mention the release of Nintendo's Legend of Zelda in 1986. Enix's first Dragon Quest title was released in May of '86, making its own path by aiming straight for the Nintendo Famicom rather than the computers that these other games had released on, and it ended up selling around 1 million copies in 6 months. By the time that the sequel came out just 6 months later, in January of 1987, a lot of other companies wanted a piece of the action, and the thing that's known as the JRPG was basically born. Naturally, it was at this time when the bosses at Sega sent out a message to the R&D2 division looking for RPG ideas. The role of lead planner for Sega's RPG project was given to Kotaro Hayashida, also known as Asale. Hayashida had recently created a pretty big hit for Sega that was also made because they'd wanted an equivalent to what the opposition had, that being 1986's Alex Kidd in Miracle World, and a top quality RPG was seen as one of the best ways for Sega to try and get more of a foothold in the Japanese market, where the Mark III, or Master System, was well behind the Famicom. A lot of the other members of the Phantasy Star team were people who Hayashida had worked with previously, such as character designer Rieko Kodama, aka Phoenix Ri, who had worked with Hayashida not just on Alex Kidd, but also on arcade games such as Ninja Princess. Yuji Mu Naka was heading up the programming, while other members of the team included Miki Morimoto, Kazuyuki Shibata, Toru Yoshida, Naoto Oshima, and Tokehiko Bo Owabo, who was handling the sound. However, the concept for what would become Phantasy Star came from Chieko Aoki. In the end, she was only credited as an assistant on the first game, but the whole idea and draft of the story, a tale based in science fiction with hefty influences from the likes of Star Wars that spread across 4 planets, was hers, and even at this early stage it was so in-depth that Aoki had written a great deal of the dialogue. Being that this idea was already so fleshed out, was so different from the RPG norm and offered so many prospects for technical innovation, Aoki's story idea was naturally the one to go for, although the number of planets in what would be the Algol star system, named after both a real-life star and a programming language, was decreased from 4 to 3 due to worries about memory on the Sega Master System. Aoki's eventual nickname of Lashiec also came from her ability to answer just about any question that the development team had about the game or her story immediately. She was that locked into it. What's often noted about the team behind Phantasy Star was that, for the time period, it featured a pretty balanced mix, plenty of men and women, and that's very much reflected in the game even beyond its main protagonist. This wasn't necessarily a purposeful decision on Sega's part. It was largely down to the way that the company worked, with the women who worked on Phantasy Star making their way up through Sega's apprenticeship systems, a lot of them making their bones on arcade games before switching over to console titles. As far as the executives went, the Phantasy Star team had a pretty open brief. They could work on the title with little in the way of interference, with the one main goal being an RPG on a 4MB cartridge that technically could tower over anything that could be done on the Famicom, and could also be something of a flagship for the Master System in Japan. While its 8-bit predecessor, the Sega Mark III, had already been out for a couple of years, Sega would replace this iteration in October of 1987 with the Master System, which was already how the system had been released internationally, improving it by having FM sound capabilities built in. Previously you would have needed to buy an add-on to enjoy FM sound on your Mark III, and naturally Phantasy Star was going to be making full use of that FM sound. It was also, as mentioned, very important for this game not to be a rip-off of something like Dragon Quest. The team studied Enix's games intensely, but doing so wasn't just to become familiar with the still relatively new building blocks of an RPG, it was to ensure that they couldn't be accused of ripping them off either purposefully or accidentally. Before all the technical flashes of brilliance though, came the characters, the majority of whom were the work of Rieko Kodama, including the main woman of the piece, Alice, or Elisa, Landale. With a heavy influence of Star Wars hanging over the story that Aoki had come up with, Alice was in many ways its Princess Leia, although really she's more important to the story even than that. Indeed, the very opening of Phantasy Star starts with something of a disruption. Nero, her brother, someone who looks a lot more like the usual sort of male hero you would expect to find in an RPG, lies dying on the floor at the hands of the evil King Lashiec's guards, leaving Alice with the task of ensuring that he didn't die in vain in a story of revenge that will soon expand to encompass the fate of the entire Algol star system. The heroism of Alice Landale is not a lot different from any usual hero's quest. The main difference is that she's a heroine, and there hadn't been too many other games before Phantasy Star that had a woman in the main role in such an in-depth game. That said, there is certainly a pathway that leads to Alice Landale, an evolution that runs from the female lead characters in other Sega games, such as Yuji Naka's Girl's Garden and Kodama's own Ninja Princess, Metroid Samus Aran, the heroes that were part of several of Namco's deeper arcade games such as Baraduke and The Return of Ishtar, and Lucia from Sunsoft's adventure platformer The Win of Medulla. So no, Alice didn't exactly come out of nowhere. She felt like a natural logical step when you consider what had occurred in gaming up to that point, not to mention a very natural fit for the team behind the original Phantasy Star. The other character that was entirely Kodama's was Lutz, or Noah as he's named in the Western translation. From all accounts, Lutz as a character came together rather easily, the mysterious Esper who's that little bit older than Alice and accordingly acts as something of a calming presence. As first designed, the gender of Lutz was purposely kept ambiguous. In fact, the original idea was that Lutz's gender could change depending on Alice's actions, although this was dropped and the story eventually just referred to him as male. These Esper characters are one of the constants of the whole Phantasy Star story. Really, if anyone had a claim to be the main characters of the saga, it probably would be them, and it all starts here with Lutz. The other two characters in the main party would not be designed by Kodama. Odin, otherwise known as Tyrann, was the work of Naoto Oshima, given to him by Kodama because she didn't feel comfortable creating a big muscular man, and Oshima, working on his first game, created an appropriately muscle-bound male warrior who, much like a lot of other similar game characters in those days, looks somewhat like a blonde Arnold Schwarzenegger. Finally, Meow, the Musk Cat, was made by sub-designer Takako Kawaguchi, who had the alias Choco. Again, the inclusion of Meow was geared towards making the game feel different, to have this strange animal as part of your party, as opposed to the norm of having a regular group of humans that were more defined by their jobs and classes. So in the end you have the female warrior lead, the much more mysterious and slightly older Esper, the big action hero and, well, the cat. It's a pretty marked difference not just from the likes of Dragon Quest, but also other games like Ultima and Wizardry that were also very much on a fantastical bent. Part of this difference also lay in the game's name. While Yuji Naka had dubbed it Phantasy Star with an F after a popular song named Nagisa no Fantasy by Noriko Sakai, Ryoko Kodama opted to spell fantasy with a PH in order to mark it out as different to a more traditional fantasy-based RPG. The name also suggests that the game is going to be fantasy but with a twist, which is pretty accurate. While Phantasy Star does take place in a more sci-fi setting, it still features a lot of the swords, magic and monsters that you would find in a more traditional fantasy-based game, making it something of a hybrid. Still, even if the world of Phantasy Star is so different to anything else that was around, with its multiple planets, alien races and futuristic themes, every RPG needs dungeons. And again, Sega wanted something that was going to stand out. Yuji Naka was largely responsible for the creation of the scrolling 3D dungeons that would end up being the original game's calling card, and certainly the main part of the game that decisively could not be recreated on the Famicom. He'd actually been working for a while on a program for dungeons on the Master System that moved incredibly quickly for the console, something that perhaps could be used in a 3D shooter. Indeed, it was almost too quick at first, according to accounts from developers. In a Retro Gamer article by Nick Thorpe about the game's creation, Naka admitted that the smoothness and quick turns of the dungeon gave him and other people motion sickness. In the end, this 3D dungeon was slowed down considerably, not just to stop people getting sick from looking at it, but also so that the 3D dungeons could be fitted into the 4MB cartridge. Even outside of dungeons, people could get a closer look at the world from the ground when they were talking to people, or simply through accessing the menu, where they'd be greeted with illustrations that still look wonderful to this day. As mentioned in a 2003 interview with Kodama, a lot of these images originally only filled half of the screen and were then vertically mirrored in order to save on memory. Speaking of memory, the 4MB cartridge with a ROM clocking in at 512 kilobytes was, as far as anyone knew, as far as the Master System could be pushed at the time. Naturally, this large size would be a big part of the game's marketing, and that would obviously have an effect on the price, along with the inclusion of battery backup for multiple game saves. The game originally sold for 6,000 yen when it was released at the end of 1987, and it was sold for the rather larger price of $70 when released in the United States nearly a year later, pretty much more expensive than anything else on the market. Another area where the game turned heads was in the wide range of monsters. There are 27 different types of monster in the game, everything from bog standard slimes and scorpions to zombies, sandworms, robots, leashes and serpents, and in addition to the 27 regular monsters, all of which have different classes, there's appropriately imposing bosses. Also, all of these creatures, largely the work of graphic designer Kazuyuki Chaotic Kaz Shibata, were drawn in plenty of detail and animated to a level far beyond anything that could be seen in something like Dragon Quest. In a 1993 interview for the World of Phantasy Star Sega book, the team revealed that they could have put multiple instances of a monster on the screen if they'd wanted, although they eventually opted to have just one in the battle screen. One of the great puzzles of Phantasy Star for people was just how the team managed to pack so many of these monsters into 512 kilobytes. And again, a lot of this was down to Yuji Naka's programming, compressing each monster's individual sprite in so many different ways in order to eke out as much space as possible. A good example of this was revealed when, in 2018, M2's Sega Ages version of the original Phantasy Star came out for the Nintendo Switch. This version featured a monster guide created by Naoki Hori, but it proved far more challenging than they'd first thought, not just to uncompress the data for all the game's monsters so that they could be used in the guide, but even to find them in the source code. Particularly when it came to one of the game's bosses, the Mad Doctor, Hori could not even find the data for it, no matter what. In the end, M2 simply had to redraw Dr. Mad and his animations from scratch for the monster guide, because it was impossible to figure out exactly what Naka had done for the monster. All anyone knew was that it saved more space on the cartridge. As was often the case with game development during this time, the whole of the Phantasy Star team were working inside the same office, everyone with their own tasks. Even Tokihiko Iwabo, producing the game's music and sound, would have been working in the same space. As with everyone else in the team, Phantasy Star was basically Bo's first experience with an RPG, although he considers the end result to be one of his finest works. It's probably worth stressing how much the team was flying by the seat of their pants, something that they were able to do because their bosses had essentially left them to their own devices to figure it out and make something with minimal interference. It's not just as if Sega weren't notable for RPGs, the gaming press would have probably picked them as the last company they would ever associate with making such a game. Such was their reputation for arcade action. And that's perhaps a big part of why Phantasy Star ended up being so different from the norm. Although the months before Phantasy Star's arrival saw Sega release 2 conversions of computer RPGs in the shape of Black Onyx, which ended up being the last game released for the SG-1000, and the PC-88 game Miracle Warriors, this was a far, far bigger deal than both of those. Everyone on the team had their own major contribution, including people like Miki Morimoto, who was responsible for the statistics and tables for the monsters, weapons, levelling up and other assorted items. She was also the main playtester for the game, charged with constantly seeking out bugs, and for this she earned the nickname of Gamer Miki-chan, also getting a little cameo appearance in the game itself as the girl on the very remote town of Sapir, who absolutely adores Sega and agrees with you that Sega games are the best. While there were other little cameos for staff members hidden away in the game, Mickey's is probably the most notable one, and one of only 2 that made it through the English translation. Others, including Takako Kawaguchi and Chieko Aoki, were unfortunately removed. Kotaro Hayashida also designed the various vehicles that would make it into the game, such as the Ice Digger, the Hovercraft and Land Rover, that would be needed to pass through the trickier terrains of Palma, Motavia and Dezoris. This focus on multiple vehicles was something he'd already used on his previous title, Alex Kidd in Miracle World. In the end, there wasn't a whole lot of drama surrounding the development of Phantasy Star. The whole team worked together well in their small space, and everything was planned out well enough for the game to be done on time. Not that there wasn't any crunch, of course. As the year rolled on, the jobs of designers, such as Ryoko Kodama, finished, and the focus totally went into that final stretch where everything has to be smoothed out and all the bugs have to be eliminated. There were certainly going to be some long days in the office and stories of members of the team such as Miki Morimoto and Chieko Aoki sleeping on makeshift beds in conference rooms, as detailed in the 93 World of Phantasy Star interview. But the game would be ready on time and ready for release on December 20th, 1987 in Japan, coming out just under a year later in November 1988 for the North American and European markets. Famously, in what still must be one of the greatest weeks for Japanese RPGs ever, the original Phantasy Star came out a mere 2 days after the release of the first Final Fantasy on the Famicom, while the story was wholly different in the West. Phantasy Star came out 9 months before the original Dragon Quest was localised and released as Dragon Warrior on the NES, and almost 2 years before the arrival of the original Final Fantasy in the US. Even despite the cartridge's high price, the game was most certainly a success sales-wise, a rare and welcome one for the Master System in Japan, and a flagship title in all territories that was undoubtedly the most advanced game available on an 8-bit machine up to that point. While there were some critical notes aimed at the game's high price, it's largely reviewed very positively, with people being wowed by the graphics, music and epic story, And nowadays, Phantasy Star frequently tops lists for the best Master System games of all time. So, it's time to look at the game in a bit more detail. This doesn't necessarily just mean going through every plot point one by one, but also looking at how things tend to play out here in a JRPG that is still, in the grand scheme of things, a pretty early one for the genre. This is, after all, still 1987. There are of course a few different ways to play the original Phantasy Star. You've got the original Western version, you've got fan translations of said Master System original that certainly improve on the original translation. There's the Phantasy Star Generation 1 remake on PS2, which has also been fan translated and features a great deal of added cutscenes and other changes, various other ports that are part of collections on other consoles, and finally there's the 2018 Nintendo Switch Sega Ages port from M2. This is closer to the original again, but with quality of life improvements such as auto mapping and the ability to switch between the PSG and FM versions of the soundtracks on the fly. And as a result, this is probably the version that most would recommend people to play nowadays. However, for the purposes of review, I want an experience that's pretty close to how it would have been back in the day, so I'm opting for the original Master System Western release. Naturally, as this is going to be quite in-depth, there's going to be plenty of spoilers. As previously mentioned, Phantasy Star begins with the death of a hero. We begin in the town of Kamenet on the planet of Palma in what this version of the game calls Space Century 342. Usually dates in the Phantasy Star universe are styled as AW342, standing for After Wars. The planet is ruled with an iron fist by King Lashiec, or Lashiec as he's called in the original translation, who was for a time a benevolent ruler, but in recent years his reign has turned to terror and martial law has been declared. Nero Landau tried to find out the cause of this change in Lashiec, but his efforts were discovered, and to set an example, he was assassinated. And here's where things begin, with the dying Nero telling his younger sister Alice to seek out a legendary warrior named Odin, and Alice declaring that she will ensure her brother didn't die in vain. And so that's all we know at the start, and naturally you can bet that finding this Odin isn't going to be entirely straightforward. Indeed, the game's going to start with a fair bit of grinding, as the majority of Phantasy Star games tend to do, so it makes sense to talk about that first. Grinding in the original kind of makes sense, even if it can be a bit slow going at first. There's even a tiny little patch of forest inside the city walls where you can fight the game's weakest enemies, the swarms, and feel as if Alice is doing the appropriate training needed to become a true warrior. As the scope of the game increases, it's fun to think back to everything starting from a tiny little forest near Kamenet, or at least that's one way to justify the hours spent walking in a circle looking for monsters to kill. Personally, I don't tend to mind the busy work of grinding too much as long as it's something I can kind of zone out on and just do casually, which Phantasy Star kind of allows. Go to the forest, kill a few swarms, occasionally go to the House of Suelo in Kamenet where you get healed for free, gradually venture out a bit further and face slightly tougher enemies as you gain levels and earn enough meseta, or money, for new equipment, rinse and repeat. There'll always be patches of grinding as you go through the game, often more in the service of earning enough cash to buy the best equipment more so than gaining levels, although generally speaking you'll always be doing the best grinding in the open world rather than having to go into dungeons to do it. Hopefully, in time, you'll come across the best grinding spot, a spot in Motavia not far from the town of Uzo, where you fight nothing but highly lucrative sandworms, ideally killing them pretty fast at that stage of the game. Still, there's a long way to go before we get there. For now, another one of the most important things that you learn early on is that you should probably talk to everyone whenever you venture into a town, happily walking uninvited into huts to say hello to whoever's inside. In an early RPG like this one, NPCs tend to be more functional rather than simply there to add colour to a place. Usually they'll give you hints and tips, or important clues, and if you were playing this back in the day it would probably be in your best interest to write them down, because otherwise finding some of the key items you need later on can be quite obtuse. And even with these clues you may well have to struggle with the vagaries and inaccuracies of the original translation. Anyway, a man called Nikis in one of the Kamenet huts will tell you that they've heard of an Odin living in the port town of Sion, not too far away, although far enough that you'll want to level a bit in order to cut through the owlbears in the forest, and he'll also give you your first key item, a Laconian pot. It takes a little while for the whole party to come together, of course. Naturally, Odin's not going to be just sitting around in Sion waiting to join an epic adventure. In fact, you'll have to go to a whole other planet if you want to have any hope of finding him. Once you press a shopkeeper for his secrets and earn a road pass that takes you to Palma's starport, you'll soon find yourself planet hopping between Palma and Motavia, a nice way for the scope of the game to be demonstrated early. The two worlds are very different indeed. Palma is, of course, the most Earth-like world, being that it's largely made up of green with lush forests and fields, and filled with Parmanians, who are basically humans. Motavia, on the other hand, is basically nothing but harsh desert and mountain, although the Parmanians have a pretty large presence here, with several large settlements on the planet, including Paseo, the first town in Motavia that you'll come across. This Parmanian expansion isn't necessarily welcomed by the local residents. Indeed, if you go exploring around a bit, you'll probably come across hostile bands of native Motavians. The majority of Motavians you'll meet are aggressive, and the same goes for the residents of the third planet, Dezoris, that we'll come to later on. It appears as though King Lashiec's terror also extends to be an aggressively expansionist when it comes to the other two planets in the Algol system. Anyway, Paseo is where we find the second member of our party, Meow the Musk Cat, who we trade with a shopkeeper for that Laconian pot we got. Meow's main specialisation is in supportive magic, which he'll learn more of later on, although he's not too bad in a fight thanks to his claws. He also knows where Odin is. Unfortunately, he's been turned to stone, and while Meow has the antidote required to save him, Ausschlein, he can't apply it because, well, he's a cat. He lacks the strength and the opposable thumbs. Still, we can go ahead and do that now, and if someone's been petrified, then naturally that means good old Medusa is going to be involved somewhere. This may be a star system millions of light years away from our world, but that doesn't mean you won't be encountering mythical monsters from ancient Greece. The process of going to Medusa's cave back on Palma is a good excuse to start talking about how it is to actually play through the dungeons. Naturally, you'll want to get prepared beforehand, grinding up to ensure you've got the appropriate weaponry and armour, making sure you've got flashers in order to light the way, and of course having lots of healing items. In this original Western translation, the healing items are called cola and burger, because Western people are fat. Okay, perhaps not for that reason. I guess someone thought that would be more understandable than the more common universe names of monomate and dimate. Also, you buy these items from first food shops, an amusing mistranslation that obviously should have read fast food. Now technically the 3D dungeons are Phantasy Star's grand calling card. It's still a wonderful effect to be seen on the 8-bit Master System, but yes, playing through them can be tricky. While this first one is relatively simple, being that it's only a single, fairly small floor, it won't take long before you have to go through caves and buildings filled with multiple floors, pitfalls, booby-trapped treasure chests, and of course, plenty of monsters. And yes, all the dungeons are less featureless, nothing but brick walls and no real landmarks or unique objects to mark the way. This is of course what you would often encounter in other dungeon crawlers or games like Wizardry. In these times you would obviously want to get out the graph paper and start making your own maps, which you can do thanks to finding a compass in this first dungeon alongside Odin, who gets unpetrified thanks to the little pot containing Ausschlein that hangs around Meow's neck. Of course, these days you're obviously able to easily access other people's maps of the game's many dungeons, or you can play the aforementioned Switch version of the game that has auto-mapping. Naturally that improves things a lot because, well, if you try to play this game and you don't do those things, and you don't create your own maps, yeah, you are absolutely going to get lost in these mazes very easily before too long. This is also a good chance to get deeper into the art of battling. Generally, Phantasy Star is quite simple in this regard, especially now that we've just got Odin, a classic warrior character with zero magic but who hits like a truck. It's mainly all about attack, attack, attack. You only ever fight one type of monster in a battle, although there can be as many as 8 instances of them, and all their HP gets shown in the top right. One of the main irritants that people find in the original Phantasy Star is that you cannot choose a target. Whether you attack physically or with magic, the target will be selected at random unless you're using something like a gun or an offensive spell that hits everybody. This does mean that a monster with low HP can potentially get another hit in if they're not targeted on a turn, which can be troublesome if you're in tough battles where every hit counts. How often you get into such situations of course depends on how well you're leveled up and how prepared you are, but it doesn't take much for things to get dicey. On the subject of targeting individual enemies, it should probably be mentioned that this wasn't a common thing in RPGs at this early stage, or it wasn't all the way there yet. While Dragon Quest II, for example, did allow you to target different types of monster if you were in a battle with more than one, you couldn't target an individual monster in a group, although that game didn't automatically tell you which monster had the least HP anyway. The original Final Fantasy may well have been the first major JRPG to actually allow you to target an individual monster in a pack, rather than fighting them as one big group. Although it should also be mentioned that the Western-made Black Onyx allowed you to target enemies individually from the beginning. If you do get into serious trouble inside a dungeon, there are a few things that can help you beyond munching on futuristic Big Macs. You can save absolutely anywhere you want in Phantasy Star, and there's actually 5 slots. You may want to take advantage of this in order to have some backup saves and the like, just in case you really end up screwing the pooch and save yourself into a totally unwinnable position. There are other items and spells that can also help. You can use the Escaper item, or Alice's Buy Magic, if you're in a fight that's clearly not going your way and you can't flat out run from, and you can also use the Transit item, or Fly Magic, to teleport to the last church you visited, or all the way back to Alice's home. And yes, this can be used inside dungeons. Phantasy Star 1 is not necessarily a difficult game, certainly not when compared to its immediate sequel. It's more a game of its time, one that generally expects you to do a lot more in the way of preparation for a dungeon, and perhaps has a little bit of a slower pace than you would expect from a later RPG, what with the time you're going to be spending doing things like grinding for money rather than levels, working your way through clues from the townspeople, or having to map out dungeons. All of this was a part of the experience. Now, while the 3D dungeons were most certainly shouted about on Phantasy Star's release, it is perhaps easy to see why the other 3 single-player games in the series never revisited them. The featurelessness of the dungeons was particularly frustrating for Rieko Kodama, as she took more and more of a central role in overseeing the games. It's not as if she didn't want them back, as she did make efforts to see if they were feasible, but if 3D dungeons were to come back in any of the other games, they had to be a lot more varied in textures, and they had to, well, just include more unique features that would allow players to make their way around them easier. Unfortunately, it just wasn't possible to do that while retaining the smooth scrolling and having them be full screen as they were here on the Master System. It wasn't possible when making Phantasy Star 2 for the Mega Drive, and it wasn't even possible when making Phantasy Star 4, even if the size of 4's ROM was 6 times bigger than that of the original. If it wasn't possible to improve the dungeons drastically on those 16-bit games, then it wasn't worth doing, and it was better to opt for more traditional top-down dungeons, which in many ways speaks to how remarkable an achievement it was to have these 3D dungeons in the original game at all, even if they are somewhat barren. So, what of the general beats in the story, and how you go about getting to them and all of that? The next one is rather amusing. You decide that it might be worth seeing Motavia's governor on Passio, but in order to gain access to him you need to bribe the guard with a gift, specifically a shortcake. Of course, if you use basic logic, you probably think that the best shortcakes in Algol are found in some town or other, probably in a food shop that also sells burgers and colas. And of course you would be completely wrong. The best shortcake seller in the land operates out of the bottom floor of a 4th floor cave that's filled with werebats and other tricky monsters. Again, this is information that you will need to ascertain through talking to everyone. Otherwise, why on earth would you ever think to look in a cave beyond it being one of the areas that's available to you at this time? One thing that does perhaps help with regards to the worlds in Phantasy Star is that at least in the beginning, it's not as if you can just go anywhere, and a lot of areas are somewhat cordoned off by things such as the clouds of poison gas that Lashiec has released to isolate certain towns. But still, it's in a bloody cave. The seller even apologises to you for setting up his shop in such a hostile location, and the developers even commented on it back in 1993. According to Kotaro Hayashida, they simply thought that it would be boring if the cake shop was just plunked down in a town, and either Mimi Morimoto or Chieko Aoki suggested putting it inside a dungeon. It may possibly have also been another little developer cameo in the Japanese version that didn't survive the translation, but that is the sort of playfulness you get from these developers. Some people who spent a long time looking for the cake shop may of course use some more colourful language there. The key with discovering where to go next is, of course, to always expect the unexpected, and, once again, talk to everyone. That's how things were done then. You're kind of left to your own devices and expected to follow an instinct to gather as much information as you can. One of the more intriguing plot points comes after you've found that shortcake and had a chat with the governor, who's sympathetic to your cause and sees the danger that King Lashiec represents. You're invited to have a little rest, but during said sleep you're thrust into a boss battle with a face called a succubus that, bluntly put, you almost certainly can't win at this stage of the game. It is technically possible, but not exactly worth doing, and when he overcomes you, you wake up from the nightmare. This dream is a signifier of something to come, of something far bigger that lurks beyond, something more than a kin that's become evil. This sort of dream sequence, and indeed the concept of the unwinnable fight, is something that Phantasy Star will revisit often, and here it does provide one of the few character points that you will find in the story. This is again one of the things about playing an older RPG such as Phantasy Star. There isn't exactly a whole lot of character development, with it perhaps only being found when a character is introduced. We'll find Noah, the fourth and final character in our party, not long after this, and once again he's introduced as a strong and silent elder sort of character, one who, as an Esper, brings more offensive magic to the party, but generally there's not going to be too much in the way of dialogue between our group once they're in. Again, this sort of thing comes down to memory constraints. We know from interviews that Kodama, Aoki and others had certain ideas, whether it was being able to determine Alice's personality by making choices in the game, and that also affecting the initially ambiguous gender of Noah or Lutz. But these ideas had to be simplified, largely due to time and memory constraints, and such things having to fall by the wayside as the game became ever more streamlined. At this stage, it's perhaps worth talking a little about the game's music. If there is one thing that certainly helps with grinding, or with making a path through dungeons, it's the game's terrific soundtrack. While this may have been Tokuhiko Iwabo's first RPG, it certainly wasn't his first rodeo with the Master System. He'd already composed and arranged music for a great deal of first-party Master System games, including Alex Kidd in Miracle World, and several arcade conversions. The original Phantasy Star is arguably his masterwork, a wide range of very memorable tunes that could easily match up to any other RPG. Still, how is this soundtrack best experienced? Through the Master System's original PSG chip, or with the upgraded FM sound? It's not the easiest decision. Obviously the quality of the tune still shines through regardless, but the cleaner tones of the FM and the rougher edges of the PSG both have their positive points. Personally, because I obviously know this original Western version of the game the best, the PSG soundtrack is what I hear in my mind when I think of Phantasy Star, but it's very much up to debate, and of course, nowadays, if you wish to hear the FM soundtrack while playing a Western version of the game, that's perfectly possible. Either way, this wonderful music is just another one of the many things that make Phantasy Star the classic title that it is. As we get further into the world of Palma and the rest of Algol, the land only ever seems to become more desolate and hostile. We come across towns that are almost totally ruined, areas that have been destroyed by lava that's not being cleared up, or even areas of Motavia that are completely impenetrable due to clouds of poisonous gas. It's at this stage of the game where the group starts to acquire various vehicles and items they need to deal with these problems. A Land Rover to cross over antline hills on Motavia, a hovercraft that can deal with the lava and travel over water, a self-explanatory gas shield, and perhaps most importantly, your own spaceship, crafted by a genius scientist called Dr. Levino that Noah tells you about when you first meet him, controlled by a robot that you find and repair in one of the many ghost towns dotted around Palma's outskirts. This spaceship is the only way that you can get to the third planet, Dezoris, where you'll also need an ice digger to get through the snow mounds. As mentioned previously, this abundance of vehicles was something that Kotaro Hayashida had made use of in Alex Kidd in Miracle World, where Sega's mascot could happily get through some stages using motorbikes and pedalcopters, but it also fits well into the general sci-fi theme, which when you look back at some of the team's other games, is something that they were pretty fit for undertaking. Just as work was beginning on Phantasy Star, Hayashida was finishing up planning on his previous game, Zillion, the impossible mission-esque platform adventure that tied in with an anime of the same name and prominently featured Sega's light phaser as a weapon. Meanwhile, Rieko Kodama's previous arcade game had been 1986's Quartet, one that she'd fully designed. The sci-fi themes of this particular multiplayer arcade, as well as the involvement of Kodama, have often led people to speculate about any possible relation that Quartet might have to Phantasy Star, if it's potentially something of a forerunner. There's not a whole lot of evidence for this really, but the prominent games that people on the team such as Hayashida and Kodama were working on do lead them quite naturally towards the creation of Phantasy Star. Now that we have the vehicles, the brunt of the rest of Phantasy Star lies in gradually obtaining the best equipment for your party, which of course you will need not just to have any chance of defeating Lashiec, but to deal with the monsters as they get stronger. By this stage of the game, grinding becomes a hell of a lot more about earning money than anything to do with levels. The best armour and weapons can be very expensive indeed, so the levels are just going to come naturally when you're trying to earn tens of thousands of Meseta in order to buy things like laser shields or diamond armours. Now that you have a full party, the way you fight can vary a little. Odin, for example, can use both handheld weapons, but also guns that are guaranteed to hit every enemy in a single turn, and are pretty damn useful when you're fighting a lot of them, while having Noah now gives you access to some pretty decent offensive magic that's most certainly a lot better than anything he can do physically, although he can also use his wands to guarantee an escape from battle if a fight gets really hairy. There are other supportive spells centred around protecting the party from attacks or buffing physical offense that can be very handy during boss fights, while some of the stranger spells even allow you to communicate with the monsters you're fighting with, which is somewhat unique, while a lot of the time they may just say something like, "What are you doing?" Occasionally some monsters may say something a bit more useful, which hints that they were once humans who have been possessed and transformed by Lashiec. That said, Phantasy Star doesn't exactly encourage you to use magic willy-nilly. There's no item available to restore MP, and you can only do it through healing in a town, so magic is really best saved for the bosses. Of course, the very best armour and weapons aren't just going to be found in shops. They'll require little quests of their own, whether it's finding Noah's master, Tarzimal, and proving that you're worthy of your task in combat, seeking out a little island to get a mirror shield that will help when you finally take on Medusa and retrieve the strongest weapon in the game, making sure that you don't stupidly give Meow away to the appropriately named cat-hating Dr. Mad, and ultimately finding the most treasured material in all of Algol, Laconia, which is apparently the only thing that can truly stop Lashiec. The search for Laconia in particular is what will finally take us to the third planet, Dezoris, the Ice World. Generally speaking, arriving at Dezoris tends to be where the big quest starts to get serious momentum in Phantasy Star games, because it's usually going to be a while before you get there. While there are a couple of Parmanian settlements on this largely hostile world, it's mainly filled by the Dezorians themselves, very tall, green-skinned, devoted to a faith, and often unintelligible. Much like the Motavians, a lot of them will also be quite aggressive indeed, meaning that unfortunately you'll have to savagely cut them down and wonder who on earth could be responsible for such blind, ugly violence. One other thing that's very important to know about Dezorians is that, well, they don't always tell the truth, something which you'll find out if you talk to everyone. The main city on the planet, Twin Town, is one of the funnier ones in the game. The people on the left will tell you the truth, while the people who live on the right tell you nothing but complete fibs. One of the most infamously cruel examples of this comes in one of Dezoris' caves. You'll be greeted by a native who tells you that you should immediately head left when you come to the first fork. And if you do, well, you get trapped in an endless prison with no way to get out unless you use a transer or magic flute. And God help you if you actually save there. Generally speaking, if a Dezorian tells you to do something, you do the opposite. Alongside Laconia, Dezoris is also where various sacred items are found, and you really get to grips with the true nature of Algol. Is it possible that there's something, an altogether greater menace, that pulls the strings behind Lashiec? The faith of the Dezorians manifests in several items: the llama nut that somehow grows on a single vibrant tree in this wasteland, a torch that's used in ceremony for the eclipse that occurs here every century and is the only thing that can melt the snow from the llama nut tree, and the arrow prism. It's said that when this is held up as close as it possibly can be to the sky, it will reveal exactly where Lashiec is hiding. Naturally, getting to any of these items isn't going to be easy. At this late stage of the game, the dungeons are larger than ever. They're not always caves anymore, oftentimes they're huge towers with several floors, and they'll either be incredibly complex and chock full of dead ends, pitfalls and worthless treasure, or they may occasionally be somewhat linear. However, to make up for that, they will be filled with the strongest possible enemies, some of which you may have previously faced as bosses. Preparation for these battles is more important than ever because many entire games have been lost to places like this, and it's only going to get tougher. It would be harsh so close to the end to get yourself into a totally unsalvageable situation, but in an older RPG like this one, it's never the best idea to rest on your laurels and think that you can just stroll into a big tower without being prepared. Speaking of big towers, well, once we're done with Dezoris, we're just about at the end game. Naturally, that's going to present the biggest challenge of them all. There are two words that will strike absolute terror into the hearts of anyone who played through this game back in the day. Baya, Malay. Once you get back to Palma and make your way through the prison that lies in its shadow, you find yourself at the foot of easily the largest and toughest dungeon in the game. A hulking 8th-floor behemoth that not only will throw endless strong monsters at you, but requires absolutely full exploration. You need to find the crystal in here in order to penetrate Lashiec's defences. To get through this labyrinth without mapping it out in one way or another is, well, virtually impossible. By this point, of course, it should be worth the challenge. It's not as if the whole game hasn't been preparing you for this moment, but it's a hell of a lot to do even if you're fully prepared for it, especially when there's no way to restore magic points or anything like that. This area is home to one more funny Easter egg. To get the crystal, you must find and speak to Damor, a master soothsayer. You must convince him that you believe in his works, whether they're true or not. Hardly oddest of his questions is, are you searching for Alex Asale? To which you must respond in the affirmative. Now for years, a lot of people wondered, who on earth is Alex Asale? You can find old threads on message boards and the like asking about it, seeing as he's not actually in the game. You may be able to figure this one out by now. Asale is part of Kotaro Hayashida's nickname, and Alex is in reference to Alex Kidd. It's possible that the translation screwed up a little and Damor was supposed to say, do you believe in Alex Kidd? Although I reckon that this kind of works out better seeing as it makes things that little bit more confusing and paints this soothsayer out even more as something of a fibber. This is one of only 2 staff cameos in the English version of the game, the other one being Mickey, the Sega fan, all the way back on Sapir, and once you figure it all out, Damor will give you the crystal that you need, and you're finally ready to go to the top of the tower. Once you arrive there, you get one of the game's most legendary sequences. The aero prism is held up to the sky and reveals Lashiec's grand palace, the Celestial Castle, accompanied by possibly the game's best composition, Sky City. From there, you feed Meow the llama nut and he bursts into light before revealing himself as a larger, winged creature who'll be able to take you there. Of course, it's not as if you're totally getting away without another big fight against a gold dragon in the clouds, another memorable moment. Happily, the Celestial Castle isn't anywhere near as complex as Baya Malay, and indeed it's largely a straight path. However, you have to do it straight after Baya Malay and a tough boss, with no church or hospital to get healed at. Hopefully you've bought enough Big Macs along. Really, you should have sold every single item that served its purpose by now and filled up the whole inventory with burgers and perhaps a couple of transers. Because this is, after all, the big finish. When you finally come across Lashiec, he'll even ask you if you wish to kill an old man. Although, naturally, it doesn't matter what you choose, because he's going to be attacking you anyway. Fittingly enough, he is certainly the toughest enemy you've faced so far. Even with all the preparation in the world, he hits like a truck, and usually hits everybody at once. If you didn't get that crystal, well, he'll basically kill you instantly. It is a tricky slog, but when he falls, it's utterly satisfying. The Sheik's reign of terror has ended, and the death of Nero has been avenged. All that's left to do now is to get back on dry land and return to the governor of Motavia with the good news about Lashiec's demise. Which of course we do after we get ourselves cleaned up a bit following such a tough slog. The whole sequence from Baya Malay to the Celestial Castle, including 3 boss fights with the Gold Dragon, Lashiec's Shadow and finally Lashiec himself, is quite the lengthy challenge indeed, and a very worthy way to finish up this game. We reach the Governor's Palace, where hopefully some sort of welcoming party or celebration will be laid on. But the Governor is not there. Instead, we suddenly get thrust down a pit and into another dungeon. Because no, it's not over yet. Why, after all, did Lashiec suddenly turn evil in the first place? It's not as if he was born that way. He used to be, by all accounts, a benevolent kin. For all that he did, his story is almost one of tragedy, of something that was possibly even beyond his control. And just what did that dream mean? The one where we were pulverised without barely a second thought? Here, under the Governor's Castle, we may find some answers. Or we may die for real this time. Much like the Celestial Castle before it, this final dungeon is largely a straight shot with the exception of a cheeky hidden wall right near the end. Usually these hidden walls are used to hide treasure, but not so here. Once you get out of this circle, however, and use the miracle key to unlock the last door, you'll find the real cause behind this whole episode. Dark Force, or Dark Fowls as he's styled here, is the pure personification of evil, the demon who plagues Algol every 1,000 years, intent on nothing but destruction. The once kind Lashiec found himself possessed and corrupted by Dark Force and those who follow him, turning him overnight into a conduit for the Force's terrors, intent on living forever and ruining his own kingdom. Back in the dream, we only saw his head, and now the whole Dark Force is in front of the party, in the flesh. He is an appropriately horrific creation, just about taking over the entire screen to the point where you can't even see how much health he has. Around 500 for the record, which is more than double that of any monster or boss. And he can attack twice in every turn with a bolt of evil that cuts down even the most hardened warriors. Being that this is the last battle, there's only one real strategy. Throw every single thing that you've got at this evil. Boost up Odin and his axe and use the strongest magic, while also being aware that you are likely going to have to heal someone every turn, and there is no heal all spell in Phantasy Star. Personally, even for all the grinding that I'd done up to this point, this battle was not easy. Even when he's weakened to a point where he only attacks once, it is still a long process. But at last, he is conquered. The true crisis for the Algol star system has been defeated. The end of the game sees one further twist. The governor wakes up from his possession, having been taken by Dark Force in one final desperate lunge following his release from Lashiec. He reveals that Alice Landau's father was, in fact, once the King of Algol, and he gives Alice a choice. Does she wish to become the Queen of Algol, or continue to live as a private citizen? This decision is entirely up to you, really. Neither choice is regarded as canon, as it's purposefully left ambiguous in future games as to whether Alice took the throne or not, but in either case, she and the rest of the quartet, Odin, Noah, and Meow, will be celebrated as heroes in Algol for eternity. For now though, the credits roll, and they do so in quite spectacular style for the time, with the names of the staff printed on the walls of a 3D dungeon. It is quite the wonderful ending for an 8-bit game, one that certainly fits the bill for an epic story that promised so much, and one that even nowadays still shines to a point where it is almost difficult to believe that it's over 35 years old. Even though so much time has passed, and even if Phantasy Star does feature a lot of the vagaries that you may often find in early RPGs, it's still a thing of beauty that achieved exactly what it set out to do. Sega wanted to make a wholly different entry into this nascent genre that would be the most amazing, most technically proficient, and most epic journey that you could find on an 8-bit console, and they absolutely pulled it off with the original Phantasy Star, setting the course for a journey that, well, most certainly isn't over yet. As a matter of fact, this video isn't wholly over yet. After all, this isn't the only game starring the almighty Alice Landau. That's worth a little look, along with some of the other versions of the original game that are kicking about. It's also worth looking at some of the reflections on the game from the people who made it. During her life, Ryoko Kodama took a few opportunities to comment on the game's creation. Primarily, she was proud of her work, even if she admitted to occasionally cringing at some of her early designs. The 3D dungeons, something which required painstaking creation for something that would be relatively simple in this day and age, was a point of pride for the whole team, along with the frame-by-frame detailed animations, and Kodama was happy not just with creating things that had yet to be done in RPGs, such as using large images to display the expression of characters, but also with the creation of Alice Landau. In her words for an interview with Swedish magazine Level, Alice challenged the common stereotype of all main characters in computer games being men. She felt that the creation and success of Phantasy Star helped to overturn some of the ideas that people already had about RPGs, even at this relatively early period for the genre in Japan. Yuji Naka, speaking to Nick Thorpe in 2017 for Retro Gamer, said that while Phantasy Star was a project very dear to his heart, he felt it could have been an even bigger franchise if it weren't for other projects gradually taking the original team away from the game, in particular Sonic the Hedgehog, which would see heavy input from Naka, Kodama, and Naoto Oshima. Back in 1993, members of the team such as Miki Morimoto and Kotaro Hayashida talked about the passion that a lot of players still had for Phantasy Star 6 years after the release of the original, to the point where there was a great deal of demand for the game to be ported to the Mega Drive in some way or another from people who'd never had the chance to play the original on the Master System or Mark III. Indeed, the demand grew to a point where the game would get a Mega Drive release of sorts the following year. Phantasy Star for Kokuban, or Phantasy Star Reissue, was released in April of 1994. This version of the game was apparently only available as part of a competition, with reports varying as to how many were made, somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000, it seems. The ROM board itself was exactly the same as the Master System game, only wired differently so that it could fit inside a Mega Drive cartridge shell and be played without requiring a converter. It's the only game to ever be released in this fashion for the Mega Drive, although unfortunately this version only featured the option of PSG sound. Other more straightforward reissues started happening from 1998, when it was released as part of the Japan-only Sega Ages Phantasy Star collection on the Sega Saturn, with other appearances over the years occurring on the Game Boy Advance, the PlayStation 2, the PS3, Xbox 360, and the Wii's Virtual Console, all the way up to the aforementioned M2 Sega Ages version on the Nintendo Switch from 2018. Other more cut-down ports of the game were also released on Japanese mobile phones through Sonic Team's Sonic Cafe portal from 2003 to 2006. There's a standard edition of the game, as well as a Phantasy Star Deluxe edition, which is mostly very faithful to the original despite having to remove certain items and be stingier when it comes to animation, and is also the first of the Phantasy Star remakes to feature an incredibly useful auto-mapping tool. Still, when it comes to ports and remakes with the most changes to the original, we obviously need to talk a fair bit about Phantasy Star Generation 1 for the PlayStation 2, a Japanese-only release from 2003 that was the first game in the Sega Ages 2500 line, offering remakes of classic Sega games at budget prices. Along with various trinkets and a book for cards that you were supposed to collect with the other Sega Ages releases, this features a full-blown remake of the original Phantasy Star, which happily has been fan-translated so that everyone outside of Japan can have a proper look at it. The Sega Ages remakes do tend to be a bit, well, variable in quality to say the least, although it's worth saying off the bat that Phantasy Star Generation 1 is definitely one of the most interesting ones, especially for those who are already fans of the series. Naturally, the graphics have got a big old boost, wholly different and much more detailed, as you would probably expect from a PS2 game, with more variation in the sprites and settings than there was in the original. The same also applies to the 3D dungeons. The old brick walls are gone, replaced by a wide range of textures. Now, does this mean that these graphics are better than the original? Not necessarily. They're totally fine as far as 2D art goes, but perhaps not as memorable as what you would find in the original. Still, this is a budget PlayStation 2 game, and as far as that sort of thing goes, this is fine, and still quite faithful to the original's aesthetics, if not a little more generic. What is certainly better though, is that there's a lot more cutscenes and a lot more dialogue between the characters, something that was unfortunately lacking somewhat in the original due to technical limitations. The cutscenes are largely still images, just as they are in the original, and the artwork for the various characters here is very good. That and the characters can also talk to each other out in the world, just as they could in the fourth Phantasy Star, which can be useful if you're in need of a hint. You may also find little Easter eggs hidden here and there if you're familiar with the games, such as the governor in Passio clearly being an ancestor of the guy who's won in the place 1,000 years later. NPCs themselves tend to have a lot more to say than they did in the original, with a lot of them having more than one line. You had to speak to some people more than once in the original, but here even the most innocuous folk walking around town are likely to have multiple lines of dialogue, and they're also named. The music has also been rearranged, with plenty more instruments and the like. I would alas say that this rearrangement does fall down a fair bit. It's not got the same immediacy of the original soundtrack, and the audio quality is kind of middling. Even if there are a lot more cutscenes, the story and general core of the game has not been messed with. There's no major changes to the planets or the various story beats, and the layout of the dungeons hasn't changed either. If you'd managed to keep hand-drawn maps of them from all the way back in 1987, they'd still be thoroughly useful here. What has changed a hell of a lot though is the gameplay, with many aspects of the game being modernised somewhat and at the very least brought in line with what you would find in Phantasy Star 4. And yes, these changes are generally for the better. Yes, you can now individually target enemies in battle, which is obviously quite useful. The process for using items and upgrading characters is much smoother. It's easy to switch between characters who now all have their own inventory. You get the option to automatically equip new weapons and armour as soon as you buy them and sell the old ones, and you get to see what stats increase with new equipment and when you level up. All of that's good. Elemental attacks are now a big part of the game when they really weren't in the original. You can buy various crystals in Caminite that add an elemental effect to your strikes, and can also be used for special collaboration attacks that are slightly similar to the combo attacks you would find in Phantasy Star 4, although the crystals do tend to break after a while. There isn't a permanent auto-map, although there is a new item that allows you to access one in a dungeon for 100 steps. And also you can no longer save anywhere, with that only being limited to towns. All of these changes were probably necessary when it comes to modernising the game, and they do admittedly make for smoother gameplay, especially if you're not that used to the vagaries and occasional brutality of the old school RPG. Speaking of brutality, generally speaking, Generation 1 is a fair bit easier than the original game. The hours of grinding have largely been ripped out. You may have to do the odd bit here and there, but characters level up a lot faster, and you also earn Maseta way quicker, making it easier to save up for the best equipment. I haven't played through the whole thing, but I wanted to do a decent chunk, and by the time I reached Lutz in the Maharu cave, my party was already at around level 20, a level I most certainly wasn't at the same point in the original, and I hadn't done too much in the way of extra grinding either. The statistics, amount of damage you do, and what you take, is generally increased accordingly to be more in line with a modern RPG circa 2003. The numbers are much lower in the original Phantasy Star, where the level cap itself was only 30, and the most health you could ever have was 218. So with all this in mind, is it worth having a look at Generation 1? Generally, I would say yes, although I would say it's certainly going to be more enjoyable if you're already familiar with the original. I wouldn't ever tell someone new to the series to go and play this one first, instead of something like the Master System game or the Nintendo Switch version. The look and music in this can be kind of generic after all, and you can certainly appreciate what this remake is trying to do a hell of a lot more if you know what the original is all about. If you do, then it's definitely an intriguing curiosity, especially for all the changes that it makes and how much dialogue it adds to the story. And when we eventually cover Phantasy Star 2, we'll be seeing another remake from the Sega Ages series that goes for some even more radical changes. But of course, that's a subject for another video. There is one other game to cover that prominently features Alice Landale as a playable character, and this time it's not a remake of Phantasy Star 1. It's a rather obscure original title for the Game Gear that only came out in Japan, although again thankfully there is a fan translation. Phantasy Star Gaiden was released in 1992, and it was not made by anyone from the original Phantasy Star team. Instead, this game's development was outsourced to a studio named Japan Systems Supply. This is actually the second of two Phantasy Star games that were exclusive to the Game Gear, but the story here means it makes far more sense to cover this game first, while leaving the other one, Phantasy Star Adventure, to be dealt with when we get to Phantasy Star 2. The story in this one takes place hundreds of years after the events of the original, on a planet called Copto that's 1 light year away from the Algol star system. The tales of Alice Landale are known and celebrated over there, to the point where there is a colony named Aliceland. The tale focuses on 2 youngsters from there named Mina and Alec. It all begins with Alec's father being kidnapped by bandits, and naturally it progresses from there to an adventure that's going to involve saving the planet from an evil force named Cabalon who was sealed away 400 years ago and is attempting to break out. Stakes are nothing if not high in Phantasy Star games, even handheld ones like this. So, right from the off, I should say that Phantasy Star Gaiden is quite flawed. A lot of the ingredients are here to make for a decent and somewhat light handheld RPG. It's not as epic in scope as a mainline Phantasy Star game, but then it doesn't need to be. Graphics and music are all okay for the Game Gear, and you're pretty much allowed to have your characters specialise in whatever you feel comfortable with. Unlike most Phantasy Star games, any one of the playable characters can equip any weapon or armour, and the only requirement is that they're at a high enough level to use them. The same is even true of spells. You don't learn spells as you level up in this game, and instead you buy them from a shop. You can also sell older ones that you don't use anymore, making the magic in this game something of a forerunner to Final Fantasy VII's materia. The one huge problem in Phantasy Star Gaiden is pretty easy to identify: random encounter rate. Holy hell, you can barely go 2 steps without getting into a fight at times. While this isn't exactly a long game and something like this would be needed to actually make the game last more than a couple of hours, the amount of encounters is just quite ludicrous. In fact, I'm not sure if I have ever played an RPG that has a higher encounter rate than Phantasy Star Gaiden. Needless to say, this can become kind of annoying, even if battles tend to go by pretty fast in this game. There is perhaps one thing that justifies the high encounter rate. The game does require a lot of grinding. Grinding in this game is somewhat annoying. There's not a whole lot of space between either effortlessly ripping enemies apart without taking any damage, or being completely unable to lay a finger on monsters, to the point where areas almost seem to have brick walls around them and you just have to take a bit of time moving around in circles and levelling up before progressing. It does get rather wearying, to be honest. Once again, at least the battles move along very quickly, and if you do get in a sticky situation, you're almost always able to run away immediately. But the amount of time you're just going to be randomly moving about on XP and Meseta hunts does mean that the game's going to become a little mind-numbing, even when compared to the grinding that had to be done in the original Phantasy Star. Does the story itself make all of this worthwhile? Again, it's a pretty light affair, but it's certainly one of intrigue for those who want to dive further into the series' universe. Nowadays, there's a more accurate fan translation of the game available than there was previously, and as you progress through the game, Mina and Alec will be joined by other characters. A dwarf, a robot, and finally, yes, Alice Landau herself. With Mina and Alec long confused by a prophecy which tells of 2 heroes who go on to save the planet and one of them being a descendant of Alice, the big twist moment in the game comes when you discover Alice in a cave where she's been cryogenically sleeping for over 400 years after sealing Cablon away. More than that, it turns out that Mina is actually a clone of Alice that she created years previously. And so, with the legend herself in your party, you defeat Cablon once and for all, save Copto, and Alice returns home to prepare, once again, for the other evils that threaten the Algol star system. While Phantasy Star Gaiden remains quite an obscure game and the events of this title aren't really mentioned anywhere else, this little portion of the canon does at least give us a bit more time with Alice. It's just a shame that the game itself can be rather irritating when it comes to trying to get through it. It's not an essential title by any stretch, but it may be of interest to fans seeing as how it is pretty easy to access nowadays. Finally, there's a couple of other things worth mentioning that aren't video games at all. In 1989, the original Phantasy Star was adapted into a choose-your-own-adventure book released by publishers Futabasha called Phantasy Star Arisa no Boken, or Elisa's Adventure. Largely this book is faithful to the plot from the original, features plenty of nice illustrations, and Futabasha would publish similar gamebook adaptations of Phantasy Star 2 and 3. Something else that's also curious is the Phantasy Star Outside Saga. This was a series of comics that were a part of the Sega Players Enjoy Club newsletter that Sega of Japan offered to fans, and there were 4 chapters of this comic. They were written by Judy Totoya, whose real name is Yasushi Yamaguchi, probably most famous as the original designer for Miles Tales Prower, and they act as a more immediate sequel to the events of the original game, detailing the adventures of Elisa and Lutz as they travel through space. If the events of this comic are to be treated as canon, then Elisa refused to become queen at the end of the game, opting instead to travel the galaxy with Lutz, exploring strange new worlds and all of that, and eventually coming into contact with people who still follow Lashiec. A couple of strips from the comic can be found in the Japanese-only World of Phantasy Star book, which is just one of several books that feature plenty of art and information about the original Phantasy Star and the series as a whole, with others including the Phantasy Star Collection and the Phantasy Star Official Production Compendium. Needless to say, they're very useful resources indeed. And with that, we've about covered everything for the original Phantasy Star. But of course, this is just the beginning. There will also be videos covering the other 3 mainline Phantasy Star games, and they are after all quite significant, even the third one. With the sad passing of Rieko Kodama, the First Lady of RPGs, in 2022, it's more important than ever for a colossal work like this to be celebrated. It shocked everybody when it first arrived, wowing people with its detail and technical prowess, and the series as a whole makes for one of the great sagas in the genre, a tale on an interplanetary scale told over thousands of years. And so, as Alice Landale goes off to take eternal guard alongside her companions, we'll be jumping 1,000 years into the future for the events of Phantasy Star 2, the first console 16-bit RPG. That will most definitely come soon, but until then, bye for now.